Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, where we dive into the world of finance, economics and policy with some of the most influential voices in the industry. I'm your host, Michael Avery, and today we've got a special episode lined up for you. So whether you're a finance professional, an enthusiast, or someone who just simply wants to stay informed about the world of finance and business, you've come to the right place. Well, South Africans this week have awoken to another country, coalition country, with some very respected analysts believing we might never see an outright majority again, just given the nature of our proportional representative electoral system, which does favour dispersion of power, unlike the first past the post system that we see in the US, for example. The question facing the governing ANC is whether it wants to be a party at the centre, preserving our constitutional values, or shifting to the extremes and rejecting the principles its founders fought and many died for. Encouragingly, it does appear the former option is on top of the list inside the ANC NEC via either confidence and supply agreement or some kind of government of national unity. And I wrote this week in Business Day that 30 years ago, Estienne Carlitz, the then Director General of Finance, described the first government of national unity budget as heralding a new era in South Africa's public finances amid economic recovery and deliberate reconstruction efforts. And it rings true today. We are an economy in trouble, but there are some encouraging, very small green shoots in energy and in other areas, and we hope that the 7th administration can really build on these. But again, it's the market. For every rand spent on debt service costs, it's a rand less for health, education and social spend. So the market and its response is extremely critical. And Roy Haveman of Crutham reminded me of Chris Liebenberg's reflection as the then outgoing Minister of Finance at the time. In the short run, you can only achieve economically doing what is politically possible, but in the long run, you can only achieve politically doing what's economically possible. And the long run has certainly arrived, as Haveman observed. Well, our guest today is Dr. Daan Steenkamp, a highly respected economist with an impressive career that spans across the National Treasury of South Africa, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and the South African Reserve Bank as well. Currently, Dr. Steenkamp is a CEO and co-founder of Codera Analytics. He's also a research fellow at Stellenbosch University's Economics Department. So very busy. His work focuses on developing advanced analytics frameworks to answer some of the most pressing questions in public policy and economics. He's got a really unique perspective on the South African economy, having been deeply involved in policy advice and economic research at the very highest levels. And in today's episode, I'm really looking forward, Dr. Steenkamp, to exploring your insights into what we need to do to really kickstart growth in the South African economy. So with that, let's get started. Great to have you on the Monocle Banking Podcast. Firstly, just tell us a little bit more about your early life and what shaped your love of economics.
Morning, Michael, and really nice to be with you. Well, I've always found trying to understand the complex relationships between economic and financial variables fascinating. I come from a statistical background, so developing mathematical models to explain those kinds of dynamics is something that's always been of interest to me.
And if you were to describe your economic influences, would you say you're a Keynesian, a monetarist, an Austrian economist, a new Keynesian? I know we like to box and label people, but what were your primary influences from an economic school of thought perspective?
So I think I have a different take on that way of framing how one thinks about the world. For me, it's really about choosing the right tool for the right question. And so understanding certain questions helps you think about what the strengths and weaknesses of different frameworks might be in different contexts. And what I like about modern macroeconomic modeling and theory is that the models people tend to use draw on different elements of different theories. So, for example, the way we think about the influence of monetary policy and fiscal policy on the economy draws from both monetarist and New Keynesian frameworks. But I think as one tries to think about the relationship between the macroeconomy and financial markets, for example, it's really useful to use some modern methods. So, for example, Bayesian methods that let you think about how you combine theory and what you might expect before you look at the data and what you can learn from the data itself. So I think for me, it's really about drawing on the best model for the question that you're looking at instead of being dogmatic about a specific framework all the time.
And I think that's a really refreshing approach, but one that also speaks of the era we're living in, which is an era where the data should be leading our decision making, and we shouldn't be, as you say, dogmatic ideologically blinkered. We should be able to look dispassionately at the data and then derive our conclusions from there. Now, you've worked at the National Treasury, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, so you've been a Springbok and an All Black, and then the South African Reserve Bank. What led you to bounce between the two, and how did each of these roles differ and influence your outlook today?
Well, part of it was I wanted to go and study overseas, so to go and experience something different. So I did my master's in New Zealand and then came back to South Africa and worked at the National Treasury. But I'd met a girl in New Zealand, and so that was the original impulse to go back the first time around. But in my second trip to New Zealand, I spent 10 years working at the central bank, and I really enjoyed being at the coalface of policy, building models, doing research to inform the kinds of policy decisions that were being made there at the time, following the global financial crisis. But I always wanted to come back to South Africa because I always felt that the kinds of challenges we have, the kinds of problems we have are firstly more important, and secondly, I think very interesting from a technocratic perspective. So I came back in 2017 to join the Reserve Bank here and really enjoyed being part of the policy discussion about the kinds of macroeconomic challenges we face in South Africa.
Did that involve any personal relationship trade-offs, or is the Kiwi girl now by your side?
No, I've been lucky enough to marry a South African lady. But for me, South Africa's always been home, although I do wear an All Blacks jersey when South Africa's not playing. But yes, no, the reason I came back to South Africa was really for professional reasons.
It's quite interesting. My uncle Hilton Trollope, who was one of the co-authors of the 1998 Energy White Paper, spent a period in New Zealand, and in a similar vein, he found the challenge of the energy transition in South Africa more appealing, more complex, more dynamic. And so ultimately, when he was looking potentially to either settle in New Zealand and work there or work here, he chose to come back to South Africa. What do you find as the most appealing aspect of working in South Africa on some of the big challenges that we face in a country that has such endemic unemployment, endemic inequality, and high levels of poverty and crime on the one hand, and seemingly is locked in this ideological debate between the market and those who really believe in market forces and the private sector to be unleashed in solving for many of those challenges, and many on the other side who will probably take a more developmental state, Mariana Mazzucato, economist type view that the state needs to continue to play a central role in fixing the South African economy.
I think there's an interesting parallel to be drawn between South Africa and New Zealand in terms of the policy space. New Zealand went through its reform moment in the mid to late 80s when it was facing serious fiscal troubles. And so I think there's some lessons to be drawn from their experience, and in the way that not only did they reformulated macroeconomic policy, but the way that they thought differently about the role of the state and managed to overcome the kind of ideological gridlock that you've described. So South Africa hasn't had that. We haven't reached that point yet. But for me, the lesson from the New Zealand experience is that it's better to get to that point before you are actually forced to deal with it in a crisis, because the social implications of that are much more severe. So the hope in South Africa is that we can figure out how to overcome the lack of consensus about what we need to do to solve our underlying problems and galvanize not just policymakers' support, but also galvanize society behind growth and reform policies that can deal with our underlying problems. And, I guess we're going to get into what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. And very interesting to draw on those parallels. But perhaps to build on that, I found it quite disheartening over the last couple of days to see public figures discussing the market as if it's some separate thing which needn't be kind of assuaged here. And to my point in the introduction, every rand spent on debt service costs is a rand less for spending on health, on education, on social spending. So the market is centrally important to the functioning of South African society. What do you see as our primary challenge fiscally at the moment? And coming back to Roy Haverman's presentation at the recent Gibbs Beyond Banking conference, the big challenge is fiscal sustainability and getting that debt under control and running a primary surplus to help us get there. But ultimately, if we can't kickstart growth, that just seems like a temporary measure. How do you characterize South Africa's broad fiscal challenge?
Well, in the context of low economic growth and against the background of the global financial crisis, which forced 10 years of consolidation on South Africa, we still haven't had sufficient fiscal consolidation to get our debt level under control. So debt service costs have been rising as a proportion of the budget, which means that the higher debt level means that it's squeezing other forms of expenditure. And so the primary challenge that the National Treasury faces is how to achieve a balanced budget over the next couple of years, and also one that brings down the debt level over time, because we have very constrained fiscal policy. There simply isn't much more that can be done in terms of reprioritization of spending. There was a lot done following the global financial crisis. So there's a really mammoth challenge to get South Africa's finances under control. But as you say, without fast economic growth, doing so is very difficult because just the amount of resources that are available in the economy is just not growing. So it makes it very hard to consolidate sufficiently without the economy picking up.
Yeah, we need to work on that denominator in terms of improving those debt to GDP ratios, to bring down our cost of capital, to lower, what bond investors are receiving on our 10-year notes, which is a huge hurdle rate for investment decisions by the private sector. When you look at the South African economy, we're talking now just ahead of the release of first quarter GDP figures, which are expected to really disappoint. I'm hearing anywhere between 0 and 0.3% for the first quarter. It's clear that we're in a state of economic stagnation. Let's just have a look at some recent work that you've done on employment and GDP growth. Your recent research suggests differences in employment elasticity across industries. What do these findings suggest about South Africa's labour market and its responsiveness to economic growth, firstly?
So we've done some work where we looked at differences in between formal and informal employment and their reaction to GDP growth. So the extent to which when you have a pickup in growth, you also have a pickup in employment. And to start, we've had low economic growth for the last several years. And so even if we had a relatively high elasticity of employment to growth, we would likely have had low employment growth. But on top of that, the elasticity, so the amount that employment responds to economic growth, is low in South Africa. It's particularly low in some of our non-tradable sectors like construction and mining and trade. And what this means is that even during periods where the economy has been relatively strong, we've not had as much employment growth as you'd want. So we've had a period of, call it, jobless growth. And the real policy question is, how can we make sure that economic growth benefits the broader South African population? And how do we make sure that we can address our very, very high levels of unemployment in South Africa? So how can we make the economy more employment friendly? And there's been a lot of work on those kinds of issues, which we can get into. But the intention of our work is just to draw attention to the fact that South Africa stands out, not just for how high our unemployment level is, but also for how unresponsive the economy is to the employment creation that's associated with economic growth.
So how would we do that from a policy perspective, other than ensuring a currency level that would make South African semi-skilled and unskilled wages more competitive globally? What other policies might help close that all-in production cost gap within particular Southeast Asia, where, if we're going to compete en masse for semi-skilled and unskilled labor, we're just not competitive?
I think a large part of the problem relates not just to one price. So it's not just the exchange rate that matters. It's that we face meaningful supply constraints in South Africa that make our economy less competitive and high cost. And I think there's a Harvard Group report which does a good job of summarizing the constraints to growth in South Africa. And they go through a lot of evidence that's been produced for South Africa about the specific things that constrain growth. And of course, the top of the list is the fact that we don't have enough electricity. So dealing with the electricity constraint really should be the number one priority. But there's a whole list of other things that make it difficult for businesses to employ people, that discourage investment, that make it difficult to run businesses in South Africa. And these are things like the fact that we don't have policy certainty. So policies are often really unclear. The state has a lack of capacity to perform basic functions like issuing documents or responding to queries from businesses. And then we've got procurement policies that dramatically increase the cost and the complexity of delivering services. So I'd invite you to go and look at that Harvard report. We did a full review of that as well.
I certainly have. And obviously, Ricardo Hausmann has for a long time been very interested, along with the Center for Development and Enterprise, in understanding those factors. Many of them are politically challenging as well. Quite clearly on the energy reform front, let's maybe start with that before we go into some of the more politically challenging issues around public procurement, because that comes with it a level of discussion around our BE and transformation policies, and what are the trade-offs and what are we willing to stomach in terms of using public procurement to further transform South African society, because quite clearly it does raise cost and introduce complexity as well as the spectre of potential corruption. But let's start with energy, and it does look, at least from the data that's being published by Eskom, that we're seeing an improved energy availability factor. That being put down to a couple of factors: that we are performing more maintenance, that the plant is now responding to that, much like a car that you're now finally servicing every 15,000 kilometers. There's also been the introduction of private power, almost 6,000 megawatts according to NERSA, of which 85% is rooftop solar. So that's hugely encouraging. And obviously we've been burning quite a lot of diesel as well. And then you've got the REAP program and a pipeline apparently of some 22 gigawatts according to Operation Vulindlela. How do you assess the sustainability of these energy reforms, and what is your base case for when we'll start to see an end to load shedding? Because I think that's the primary constraint on economic growth at the moment.
So I think it's very encouraging, as you've suggested, that at least over the short term, it seems that conditions are improving. Of course, part of the reason this is the case is because we've lost such large amount of manufacturing capacity and industrial capacity. The lingering impact of a decade or more of load shedding has meant that there isn't as much demand. There hasn't been as much demand as there would otherwise have been. So this has a meaningful impact on South Africa's capacity to grow. And so as you've said, that the Reserve Bank has produced estimates of the impact on growth, and they expect it to, as the electricity constraints begin to ease slightly over the next year or two, that the amount of drag on growth will ease. But I think there's a more fundamental challenge here, in that it's taken 17 years for government to remove the prohibition on private participation in electricity generation. So there hasn't been responsive government policy making to deal with something that was not just an emerging challenge, but a very meaningful, ongoing problem. And so I think the bigger question is, how do we make sure that policy is more responsive? How can we get more aggressive as a society with dealing with this problem going forward? So I think, you mentioned Roy Hoffman's book. I think he makes a very good point about the fact that we need to think about the unbundling of Eskom seriously. And that's obviously incredibly complex, but we need to deal with the challenges, not just in Eskom as a state-owned enterprise, but with our other major state-owned enterprises that are constraining the ability for the economy to grow, if you think of ports and transport.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, in the area of policy making, what seems to have happened is that we've got fantastic capacity in academia, in the private sector, and in the public sector. We've got policy wonks and mandarins. We've got the ability to lean into fantastic data and research. But in many instances, one can argue that public policy has been hijacked by political actors bent on seeking resource and rent extraction and not what is best for the public. So my question is, how can policymakers then better leverage data and things like advanced analytics that you work on in Codera to inform their decisions and to address the country's economic challenges? How can we depoliticize the public policy space, for lack of a better word?
So I think the value of data in this context is to bring attention to some of the obvious problems that we're experiencing, the underlying things that are causing the problems that you highlight. Things like showing the impacts of preferential procurement on the cost of procurement for government. The availability of that kind of data helps us highlight what aspects of policy might be contributing helps us understand the kinds of problems at a micro level. I also think that there's a lot more that we can do to make public data available. So South Africa stands out by global standards and compared to leading emerging markets in terms of a lack of data that describes what is going on at grassroots level in specific places. So we don't have good data on city level economic and social development in the way that you do in many other leading emerging markets. And so part of the challenge for government is to work more actively to make that kind of data available. And part of this is a cultural element. If you look at some of the leading emerging markets that have very similar socioeconomic problems to us, but are leading in terms of making data available, both for business and for policymakers to understand what is going on, and then to work together to think about what can be done to fix things. So I think a big part of it is for government to be leading with making public data available, to democratize data more. And so that's part of what we are doing at Codera, is we are unearthing data that should be in the public domain.
Yeah.
And also then combining it with proprietary data to be able to understand what is actually going on and what developments mean for trends in industries and policy.
In data science, there's a great saying, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. And I was reminded of that when I started following you on LinkedIn and reading your articles in Business Day. And your mission at Codera seems to be, or part of it at least, on exactly that, as you've just described, making data and public data more readily and easily accessible so we can let that data effectively do all of the hard talking. And, when you're talking about data like that, I know they say you can make statistics, you can interrogate them until they tell any story you want them to say. But, I mean, this data is pretty unequivocal. Would you say that was part of the mission that inspired you to found Codera Analytics? Maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about how that came into being, the founding of Codera.
What we're passionate about is enabling the kinds of insights that you've described, the automation of the systems that make that possible. So how do you, at scale, make it possible to collect data and interrogate the data and reveal the insights from the data systematically in a way that you can automate and systematize? So what we do at Codera is we build frameworks for automation of things that use economic and financial data. So for me, it's about how can we maximize the impact that we can get from what we know about our business, our industry, our economy, and over time enrich those insights with, as you combine more and more data, you get clearer and clearer understanding and better projections. And this really makes a big difference in a business context, but it also makes a big difference for society as a whole. If we can better characterize what our problems are, if we can better understand what the underlying drivers are of the economy and underlying causes are of challenges, then we can formulate evidence-based policy, and it can help companies better strategize and plan in order to deal with the kinds of problems and volatility that we have.
It's been absolutely fascinating chatting to you, Daan, and I need to have you back on the show just to focus on monetary policy. We've been talking a little bit about fiscal policy, and there's some real deep down debate that we need to be having around the Reserve Bank. And, the Reserve Bank is not without criticism. It's a fantastic institution, don't get me wrong. I have a lot of respect for the MPC and Letsetsa Kganyago, and, the populist wave of let's nationalize the Reserve Bank has almost meant that it's beyond criticism. But there is a debate to be had around monetary policy, inflation targeting, the way the bank communicates. Should we see a bit more transparency, for example, like we do with the minutes from the Fed? We don't necessarily have to know exactly which way each member voted, but there is a huge debate to be had in that. So I'm going to have you back on because we can't go down that rabbit hole just yet. But I've got to ask you, as we're reaching the end of our time, what can a new government, and we've mentioned some of it, but from your perspective, if you were advising a new administration, be it a government of national unity or a coalition, what would you like to see a new government do to get the country back on track after 15 years of stagnation and decline?
I think the most important thing is that we need to galvanize support for economic reforms that generate jobs and stimulate investment. South Africa needs to grow faster, and we need to grow employment. The tragedy at the moment is that the debate about economic policy is all about the Reserve Bank and the National Treasury and more redistributive policy, instead of thinking about what the policies are that we need to make South Africa have a higher GDP per capita and be, a more prosperous country over time. So I think at the moment, the political debate is distracting us from having a serious conversation as a society about what we need to do to get South Africa back on track. So the hope is, however things play out, that South Africa can have policies that deal with our electricity constraints, the challenges in our state-owned enterprises, deal with the government's capacity challenges, the challenges to service delivery, and then importantly, how do we unleash the private sector to create jobs and to create investment? Because there is this latent demand for the private sector to invest in South Africa because our long-term fundamentals do look good. But everybody is waiting with bated breath for evidence that there will be a reform program, a significant reform program initiated. And so I think once that signal comes, we have potential to grow. And the trick is going to be to make sure that the way that happens helps us deal with our unemployment problems.
Yeah. And, I tend to subscribe to that view as well, that if we can see an avoidance of any what they're calling doomsday coalition type scenario, and we can see a seventh administration that focuses on these very core fundamental issues of growth, then we'll see a private sector with confidence starting to reinvest. And with that, you start to get onto the radar screens of global capital allocators, and we see an increase in foreign investment, hopefully coinciding with global interest rates declining and a better and more favorable macroeconomic environment as well. And all of those issues kind of coalescing together at the same time. But it really does start with the adults in the room across from each other who are negotiating any potential GNU or coalition government, understanding that this election was fundamentally about the economy. There was a great article in the New York Times where the journalist spent some time with a couple in Dobsonville in Soweto, and they said quite bluntly that the ANC may have had a plan to defeat apartheid, but it didn't seem to have a plan to deal with the economy. And all they want is the prospect of a job that can pay them an income that gives them the prospect of a better life. And to get the skills to do that, it's bread and butter issues. It is actually about the economy finally. So one does hope that we can have that deep down searching debate about how to grow the economy once all of the political horse trading has settled down. Thank you very much, Dr. Daan Steenkamp, founder of Codera. That wraps up this week's episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast. Before we go, just a reminder that you can find us on all good podcast platforms out there, growing the audience every week. If you want to connect, reach out to me at The Badger on Twitter or email the team at Monocle. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, don't forget to subscribe.